Difficulty. The thing that everyone finds whether they want to or not. Difficulty is encountered everywhere, but is something that is less often spoken about in media like video games. It is typically only brought up when something is mind-numbingly easy or incredibly hard to the point of wanting to pull your hair out. Looking at you, Dark Souls. But is something everyone wants to be fair, fun, and just enjoy their time. A game can be easier or harder depending on how much of a challenge a player wants or can handle, but still should be fair at the end of the day. There are so many games I have personally enjoyed not because they were difficult, because they were interesting in other manners, being the story or world building. Yet, at the same time, there are also a lot of games that do not stick out of my mind unless the title and maybe the gameplay are brought up, because they lack proper difficulty among other things. There are so many variables that can play into fairness of difficulty, such as multiple difficulty options, scaling or dynamic difficulty, fundamental difficulty, enemy AI, items, mechanics, tools, or a player's skill level, and so on and so forth. But where does difficulty in games really begin? The true origins of video game difficulty are in itself difficult to narrow down to when and who with the public information that is available. From what is found, there can be multiple different developers that may have started that mindset. Difficulty started as just levels scaling upward in difficulty and did not have the traditional saving or checkpoints as we know today. The method they did have was passwords for saves. This is because of various limitations at the time with technology, but after the NES, most games were not as difficult for the simple reason of just having a save feature and not having to either write down an annoying password, beat it in one sitting, or leave the console on until you did. Alright, is that a 0 or a lowercase o? Oh motherfucker. We only started to see more difficulty options later into the 1980s, but one of the first home console examples is Adventure on the Atari 2600 in 1980. Adventure offers 3 different difficulty options. Level 1 being the easiest, as it uses a simplified room layout and doesn't include various elements. Level 2 is a normal difficulty with no limitations, with everything being set in a default position at the start, while Level 3 is similar to Level 2, but the location of the objects is randomized for a greater challenge. A more well-known example is Castlevania in 1986, which also has 3 difficulty options, with the hard mode including more challenging enemies and bosses. But even in the earliest examples of difficulty options, all games are still following one of the earliest developer elements, but it may have been a bit rough, where the difficulty between each level was not a small bump up from the previous. This element being a traditional difficulty curve, which is generally seen as a smooth difficulty transition between all levels all the way to the end of the game. The agreed upon definition for difficulty curves is, quote, "The difficulty curve of a game defines how the game's difficulty changes over the course of gameplay," end quote. The traditional difficulty curve is a smooth, curved line graph and is still used in some game design today. It has been used in so many beloved games, ranging all the way back to the early generations of video games. A well-known classic example using the difficulty curve mindset is Chrono Trigger. Immediately from the beginning of the game, it starts off easy and gradually increases in difficulty as the game progresses in a smooth curve. As it introduces new mechanics and enemies, it does not necessarily slow down on the difficulty, but it does not need to because of how it handles having players understand the mechanics, proper enemy level balancing, and being easy to understand immediately. While it does run into the problem that some bosses or levels can be more difficult for players than expected, nothing feels near impossible to beat and continue forward. The farther you go back in time, the difficulty curve mindset is either not used as frequently when designing a game, or not used at all because of how the market was at the time. While some of the earliest games do have some type of difficulty curve and or difficulty options, some of the earliest games in arcades were notoriously difficult to beat. But why? Most games near the end of the NES's life and beyond appear to have some type of proper difficulty curve, but then why not arcade games? Unlike most home console games at the time, like the NES, arcade games, even up to today, are incredibly difficult by design because they want the players to progress a bit before hitting an artificial wall of extreme difficulty.
No, 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 no. Wait. Wait.
Where they lose and have to put more money in to continue to play. Unfortunately, it is a scummy business practice, but it does make sense to a degree. A lot of these arcade games do have a difficulty curve, but in the form of walls more than anything. The artificial walls make the frustrations with such difficulty even worse when the player cannot get time to relax and become comfortable with the new enemies, mechanics, and/or puzzles. It will likely turn into the player being overwhelmed and stuck in a vicious cycle of progressing, hitting something incredibly difficult and losing due to the artificial wall, spending more money, repeat. While the traditional difficulty curve graph is satisfying, yet expected on a surface level and expected when you think of how it would work, but this curve has flaws. What are they? Depending on the range of how the curve is set can make a player feel one of two ways, or possibly, if poorly designed, a mix of both. 1. If the curve is too steep, it can cause players to have constant tension because of the difficulty, which can lead to feeling more easily frustrated and can turn into a vicious cycle of becoming more frustrated when failing, ending in the result of the player feeling that the game is unfair and far from fun. 2. Too low of a curve, the little amount of tension in the difficulty may lead to the possibility of boredom, which will only exponentially get worse if it does not give any challenge, ending with the player feeling like the game is too easy and can just play in an autopilot sense, or just stop playing if they are bored with it. Having a good difficulty curve for a game can have a much bigger impact than anyone playing a game would expect. If a game becomes very difficult too fast or boring due to various aspects, it can turn into a game that is not often highly regarded or gains a larger fan base to talk about it in a more positive manner, which leads to that game being dropped into a graveyard of mediocre or bad games and falling by the wayside. That does not always happen, but that is a typical case for games that have poor difficulty curves. The traditional difficulty curve still has flaws, and unfortunately even modern classic games have run into this problem, such as Dark Souls 1 and 2, being the most modern, infamous examples of high difficulty, where it has enough unique aspects for people to remember it and still play, yet the difficulty curve is not very smooth and is not always remembered for the best qualities and mix of frustrations with them. There is a newer iteration of the difficulty curve that helps lessen the flaws of it, which is the difficulty saw. The difficulty saw drops the difficulty down at points during the progression of the game, which may seem a bit odd on first look, but is overall better for the players and developers. The reason is it allows the player to learn the new thing given to them at whatever point in the game while not feeling overwhelmed or having it feel unfair if it becomes difficult too fast, giving the player some breathing room before getting harder challenges using it, while at the same time it allows the developer an easier time on how they create the game and levels without having to figure out making something constantly more difficult that is interesting but does not lose interest. So how does this look with newer games that use this mindset? Many good games have been released throughout the years with a good difficulty curve, or more recently, the SAW method, but let's focus on two recent games. One of the best examples from 2023, being a new game in its lineup, is Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Nintendo games most often have a good difficulty curve, but the only caveat to that are games being on the easier side. Not you! Super Mario Bros. Wonder does sit on the easier side, but unlike other Mario games, its difficulty saw mindset is better than previous games that may have used the difficulty curve mindset, as it sprinkles difficult levels throughout the game as the player understands the design, enemies, and mechanics shown or given to the player around that point, but will lessen when something new is introduced. With previous games, the player may have levels that jumped up in an unexpected difficulty spike, while not near impossible, like arcade game artificial difficulty walls, it can throw off a player. At the beginning of the game, like most others, the levels are simple, easy, and straightforward to allow any player to become more comfortable with the basic movement and mechanics that will be seen across the entire game. Within the first world, new level mechanics and movement mechanics can be equipped, are introduced, but start off on the easier side to allow the player to understand them before slowly increasing the difficulty in the later levels and ending in the most difficult levels for that world. After the first world, the difficulty goes into a form of repeating, with any of the available worlds, but slightly more difficult as to be expected with the difficulty saw mindset. Overall, the difficulty increase is much smaller than expected from world to world until the final 2 worlds. That is because of the game being more of a pseudo-open world, allowing the player to explore nearly any of the worlds at any time, so they have to keep the difficulty slightly lower than expected because of it not being linear. A linear game that was also released in 2023 in comparison being the Dead Space remake. The remake, much like the original, follows the same overall level design and difficulty, but with some additional level design to better fill out parts of the game to interconnect every major area. The game starts off the player with just learning the basic mechanics before throwing more difficult fights and situations that can overwhelm a player if they are not comfortable with the mechanics already introduced. As the game progresses and the difficulty slowly increases, when something new is introduced, like a new utility being telekinesis or a new weapon, the difficulty is backed off a little bit so the player can learn and understand how it works before moving back into the same slowly increasing difficulty as before. The difficulty saw is similar to how the graph represents it, with the gradual increase of difficulty before lowering a bit to introduce new mechanics and increasing again, but this only includes the intended difficulty modes such as normal difficulty or one difficulty mode which is higher or lower than the normal difficulty that the game has been designed around. It does not often include the highest difficulty modes where the difficulty saw or curve mindsets are non-existent. While these higher difficulties are meant for playthroughs after the initial intended difficulty mode playthrough, if someone for various reasons wants to play the higher difficulty without playing the intended difficulty first, will only cause the same problems with more poorly designed games and may sour or outright ruin their first or second experience. More often than not, these higher difficulty modes are not thoroughly playtested beyond the basics to make sure it functions. Not that it's a reasonable difficulty or balanced in some type of way to prevent frustrations. A large amount of the time, it is found from a game commentary of its development, if the highest difficulties are mentioned, is that the developers did not have time to put more effort into polishing those highest difficulties, which makes sense from the end results. There are a lot of infamous examples of insane higher difficulties such as Halo 2, Call of Duty World at War, Doom 2016, where the highest difficulties are far from fair in a difficulty sense. With the Halo 2 example, immediately from start on Legendary, the player is going to run into a difficulty wall that, unless they use a broken weapon combo and break the game in some ways to exploit the painful enemy AI, and even then it's going to be a brutally punishing time, which is often not the player's fault.
Double kill. Triple kill. Overkill.
This is not even mentioning the enemy types and layout as the game progresses, making it even worse. While some people enjoy these extreme difficulties, I'm concerned for your mental health if that is the case. Most people, including myself, hate and dread these difficulties because they are just frustrating and not fair most of the time. The immediate response is, well, then don't play it. And yes, the player can do that, but if they want more of a challenge over the recommended or normal difficulty, the player is limited to higher difficulties that may not be fair. Another possibility is if the player is wanting to get achievements in the game as well, where the achievements are attached to that difficulty. An idea that would require more work for the developers, but would be overall better for higher difficulties in the case with Halo 2 is instead of increasing the enemy aggression, accuracy, health, and damage, while increasing those values a small amount where the AI is not insane, but the player has to play smart, but also adding an additional behavior such as flanking or tactics to surround the player, making them more interesting to fight in the higher difficulties. Adding additional content into the highest difficulties can allow the developers more freedom to make a harder challenge while not making the game feel unfair due to the limitations they have with the intended difficulties, but because of the amount of work it would take to even allow for this type of experience is unlikely. When it comes to choosing a difficulty option before starting a game or even changing it during a playthrough is good, but can be a problem. While most often there is a text description clearly stating or implying who the difficulty is designed for, which does help, but does not guarantee that the chosen difficulty will be the best first or even second experience of a game, which also includes scaling difficulty or dynamic difficulty that can result in the same problem. The first experience with a game can make or break a new player wanting to continue playing it until the end. The second replay experience is nearly just as important, because if it's not enjoyable, it can damage the new player's understanding and impression of the game, making them either drop the game or look at it far less fondly. So many developers have attempted different methods of trying to balance the difficulty of games, but there have and will always be pros and cons to every method, so it turns into what method works the best for most players. When games are being designed and the difficulty curve or SAW mindset is being followed, those games are often remembered for the positive aspects of them, while poorly designed games and or difficulties are only remembered for the worst of things. Even the most well-designed games have those levels where they are not remembered fondly. It's a careful dance that developers must play to make sure that the player enjoys the game as much as they can, while at the same time keeping on track to release the game. Difficulty at the end of the day can vary wildly, where there can be very high peaks and very low trenches of difficulty quality. Difficulty in games is a very weird area where you can go down the rabbit hole of why things are like they are and how things should be, at least in someone's opinion, but the agreed upon fact is that a game should be fair, and no matter the difficulty from the easiest to the hardest is fun. Thanks for watching my first video. I've been wanting to do some video opinion essays for a while. Please let me know what I can improve on. I very much appreciate it, and I hope to see you next time.